Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back, as is Tim Mathews. Today we're talking about the 1999 film, The Green Mile. It is the last of the 90s adaptations, and thankfully it is one of the best ones, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And also, I didn't realize this was 1999 until you said that.
Yep.
I haven't seen this in a very, very long time. I want to say I saw it in theaters, but maybe not. I may have seen it on VHS for the first time, but I definitely saw it when it came out, around the time it came out, something like that. And it's just as good now as it was back then. There was definitely things I was like remembering as I was watching it, but I was like, I'm sitting here and just like getting all emotional, and I'm like, oh my god, I was like, this movie.
This was one I had watched before too, but I had watched it way more recently. It was probably only a few years ago. I don't know. I want to say within the last 5 or 10 years, give or take, because my parents had it on DVD. And I was like, okay, I'm going to watch this eventually for the podcast, but I wanted to watch it sooner than that because I'm pretty sure it was one of those movies that ended up being on cable TV a lot too, just like on TNT or USA or whatever at times. Same with Shawshank, unless I'm completely off base there. But
I mean, probably it's Frank Darabont and it's Stephen King, so
yeah, exactly. Frank Darabont actually approached King about doing this movie before the first installment was even out, because the book released in 6 little books first, and then they collected it into a full book after the fact. But the original release was like a serialized novel. So I have the 6 little books, and then
that's how I have it too.
yeah, and then Frank Darabont was like talking to Stephen King about it, and he was like, send me a copy and, give me first dibs, basically. So he even went as far as flying to Colorado, renting a car, and driving up to the Shining set to make sure he was the one who was going to get the rights for The Green Mile.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, those are some fun little facts from the screenplay book that I have, and it had storyboards in the back too, so it was pretty cool. But I do want to talk about the actual movie because this cast is just so good. Everyone plays their role so well, especially Tom Hanks as Paul Edgecombe, and then Michael Clark Duncan, who has sadly since passed away, as John Coffey. Even, just the other cast members who maybe didn't have big parts, but Sam Rockwell as Wild Bill was just so crazy. And even just, the trustee prisoner Toot Toot, played by Harry Dean Stanton, if I'm not mistaken, it was just so impressive.
Yeah, no, the cast is absolutely stacked. I mean, even Tom Hanks' wife in the movie is played by Bonnie Hunt. Like, it's like, and I always forget his name, but the guy from Babe as the warden.
Oh, James Cromwell.
Yes, James Cromwell. And he's absolutely incredible. How they got this cast, who knows? I mean, except for the fact that, it's Frank Darabont, and then also it's Stephen King. And especially at this time, anyone who's an actor is going to hear about this great project by Stephen King and they'll want to be involved. But the fact that not only did they get so many great actors, they have to cover such a wide range of drama, and then being able to like slip into these little bits of comedy that undercut the drama but feel like in a natural way.
Yeah.
Not in a
not forced.
Why do you have like why sometimes granted they're superhero movies, but sometimes in superhero movies it's like you'll have this nice dramatic moment and then there's like this quip and you're like, well, I kind of took the punch out of the emotion there. It's like this, it takes the punch out of the emotion but in the right way, because it feels like the characters are doing that. It's almost their defense mechanism of this horrible job that they have to do day in and day out to make that environment feel lighthearted for a lot of this film is quite extraordinary.
I also want to note that David Morse, who plays Brutus, one of the guards, he is 6'4", and Michael Clark Duncan was 6'5", and I think what they did for a majority of the movie was they had Michael Clark Duncan on a platform, and
Okay.
he was walking down these platforms, standing on these platforms, because in the movie, he looks at least 6 inches taller than Brutus. And Brutus is supposed to be, the big guy on the block as far as the guards go, because then you have Percy, who is this tiny, tiny man.
Yes.
And he has sort of this small guy mentality where he just has to be a bully. And I don't want to say every guy on the shorter side is like that, but it's something that I've seen, especially recently with just some videos on Twitter and things like that, where there's these like small guys confronting these guys who are like twice their size. It reminds me so much of Percy in this movie because he's just a jerk to everyone. And then you have John Coffey, who is just this sort of gentle giant. Obviously, he can rough someone up if he really needs to because of his size. You look at his biceps and they're like the size of everyone else's head.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, having him be this tiny, this tiny spoiled brat, everything handed to him, you can tell he's boasting to try and make it seem like he deserves all the things that he gets, not because of it being handed to him. It's like, no. It's like, I'm a badass. I'm awesome. I can have power over you. But then on the same side, it's like when he can tell that someone's calling his bluff on his boasting, that's when he brings in the, don't you know who I am? Don't you know the connections I have? And he plays it so well. I watched a making of special. It was like a half hour. It looked like it was on the Warner Brothers YouTube account, actually, if anyone wants to look for it. But he talked about how he was so excited to be a part of this film and be with these like great actors. And he's like, I finally get this role that I get to really sink my teeth into and everything. And he's like, and I play the jerk. He's like, I want to be a part of like the club of the other guys like hanging out. He's like, but instead my character has to be like off to the side and everybody hates him. But he said that, it was like a club within like the actors that, these people like Tom Hanks and everyone who's been working in the industry and doing bigger things for longer than him welcomed him with open arms. And Michael Clark Duncan said the same thing. He didn't have as much experience, obviously, as someone like Tom Hanks. And he has this really, really imposing size and appearance, but he plays the gentle giant so wonderfully.
Yeah, and I was reading up on some of the cast members, and Doug Hutchinson, who plays Percy, has a little bit of a weird kind of history because when he was 51, he married a 16-year-old.
Weird.
And they just had their divorce finalized earlier this year, and she's now only 25. So he's one of those Hollywood people who have gone on to make questionable decisions, to say the least. It's still one of those things where you're like, okay, if he was 51 and she was 16, that's a
it's pretty gross.
big difference.
Yeah.
And also she's a minor still. So
yeah,
I just wanted to get that out there because I know that when Me Too first started, we heard about all of these different stories coming out. And personally, I have a hard time keeping track of all of these stories. There are obvious big ones like Harvey Weinstein, Kevin Spacey, and these people who have been accused of multiple things, Bill Cosby, so on and so forth. But when you have something that is like this, where I don't know if I've seen this guy in anything other than the Green Mile, it's one of those things that you're not going to necessarily hear as much about because I don't really remember hearing anything about this when they got married back in 2011. Maybe I just wasn't following the news then because I had just graduated high school, started college. So I was barely older than this woman.
When I was watching the movie, he has one of those faces where, it's like when he gets on the screen, I instantly remembered how much of like a terrible person he plays in this movie.
He has a punchable face.
Yeah. And the only thing that I was thinking was like, I was trying to think of, what else have I seen him in? But and I couldn't pinpoint anything else I'd seen him in, but like my internal feeling was that whatever I saw him in, that he always plays this kind of a character, that he always plays a shitty person.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if that's true, because I can't tell you what else it's been in. I'd have to pull up his IMDb.
I'm doing that now. He was
Yeah.
in 7 episodes of Lost. He was in Punisher Warzone from 2008.
I did not see
He
that
was in a handful of episodes of some other random shows. Kidnapped, Guiding Light. Let's see what else. I Am Sam. I don't remember him in I Am Sam, so he must not have had a very big role. He was also in Batman and Robin, which, again, I have no recollection of his character.
You know what? I think that's the movie I'm thinking of, though.
He was Gollum in Batman and Robin.
I think, yeah.
And he was Donald in Con Air. So
okay, yeah. So those are probably the 2 movies that I'm remembering him from, and
those were just before his role in the Green Mile. So that's what makes me think they weren't huge roles, because it seems like this was the role that everyone ended up remembering him for, and it doesn't look like he's been super, super active.
yeah, no, I'm not seeing much else, and I don't even remember him from Lost, but I mean, I guess, you know, seems like an odd and you know, potentially not great person, so he played it well. I don't know.
Maybe it just came naturally to him. But aside from that, I think that was sort of the only thing I found in regards to the cast, as far as anything in a more negative light. Obviously, you know, I think Tom Hanks is one of the still beloved celebrities of the last several decades now. Yeah,
and everyone said, you know, obviously that, you know, he was so wonderful and kind on set, and that it, you know, he was constantly just making people laugh, even if he wasn't necessarily saying anything funny. He just had this way about him. One of the really cool stories that I liked from the making of was Frank Darabont talking about Michael Clark Duncan being on this set and not being as experienced in this big of a production as some of the others, but everyone that worked with him like wanted to raise him up and help him do his absolute best work. And he talked about Tom Hanks doing the scene with him where he's, you know, pleading with him, you know, what would you have me do? What do you want me to do? Tom Hanks is off camera and feeding him his lines. And Michael Clark Duncan is talking about how he's off camera and like Michael's eyes are, you know, and face is covered in tears because he's acting in the scene. But here's Tom Hanks off camera and his face is covered in tears. And Frank Darabont described it as like he's giving an Academy Award winning performance
off screen.
And he's like risking it, as he describes it, you know, risking the chance that he'll get to when he's doing his scene and maybe not have anything left from what he did off screen. But it didn't matter. He was doing this scene and watching these 2 incredible actors together. And I thought that was a really, really spectacular story.
I think everything that Tom Hanks and Michael Clark Duncan do in this movie, as far as their scenes together, and even when they don't have scenes together, is just so outstanding that they're really
Absolutely.
the highlight performances for me. It's like, yes, Percy was a jerk and Doug Hutchinson was really good at playing that role, and Sam Rockwell went all out with his Wild Bill performance. But
yeah.
it's just something about the chemistry on screen between Tom Hanks and Michael Clark Duncan. And, you know, I don't mean chemistry in like any sort of romantic sense, obviously,
Right.
but you can just tell when 2 people click on screen and you know that the back and forth is going to be good. And you have Paul putting his trust in John Coffey, because as soon as this big guy says he's afraid of the dark, you're kind of like, oh, that's a weird thing for a murderer to say. And then the wheels start turning as to whether or not he actually did this. And story-wise, I think this is done really well. There are some tropes in it. You know, of course, it's the black person who has the magical powers, and that seems to be a trope that has been used in many horror fantasy kind of stories. In this case, I think what King does really well is the character work. And that's something I've been talking about so much on this podcast because he gives us characters that are relatable and likable. And he also gives you characters you can hate, like Percy. And this is a wrongful conviction story that ends in the worst possible way for the wrongfully convicted man. And it's something that still is being fought against in 2020. So the fact that this still resonates, 21 years later, as far as the movie goes, obviously the book came out before that, but it's just such a powerful story that anyone who watches this and doesn't feel anything is probably not human.
Yeah, the development of the characters, as you said, specifically with between Tom Hanks and Michael Clark Duncan, like the material they get to work with as their characters separately and together grow and develop, and you get so sucked in. Like, not once did I don't ever feel the 3-hour runtime of this film.
Right.
It flows so incredibly well. As I said earlier, it ebbs and flows between this feeling of sadness to feeling of anger to all of a sudden I'm laughing at this, slight little joke, or a scene cuts and after something horrific and the music in the next scene feels lighthearted, and it doesn't feel jarring. Like, the story does feel almost fairy tale like, watching it does have this separated from realism, obviously aside from the fact that there's magic in it. But it just, even just the way it's shot and everything, it has this feeling of a parable, and that someone is like someone sitting down and telling me a story, which kind of the movie sets it up that way too, with the older version of Tom Hanks's character. But the fact that, especially with John Coffey, his character isn't just this good person. I mean, he is the embodiment of good, but he's heartbroken by it.
Yeah.
He's tormented by it. He has this gift, and you can tell he's happy to share this gift. You can tell that he knows it's what he's meant to do, even if he doesn't know why him. But that running theme of he's tired, it's interesting to think about how long has this been, because I don't know if we know how old he is, but how long has this been his life? Whereas he says he's tired of being alone, tired of not having a friend to share experiences with, tired of just wandering. And, I'm sure he's probably helped a lot of people. But then in helping people, he internalizes all this pain. And of course, he injects it or ejects it, afterwards. But it certainly doesn't seem that emotionally he ejects from that. Like, it really feels like he's carrying with him all the pain that he's relieved from other people in the world. And I think he's realized that it will never be enough. And I think that that's something that's so heartbreaking. And one of the things that does really resonate here in 2020 is that of course, there's wonderful stories of good people and quote unquote miracles happening, and it's like, oh my gosh, you hear a wonderful story and you're like, that's so great to hear good news, and then 2 weeks later you feel like you're right back to where you started, at seeing some horrific atrocity or a natural disaster. And those scenes really, really got to me, him having that conversation of just, people keep doing this to each other. People keep hurting each other, whether they realize that they're doing it because they want to, whether they realize it because they hate, or whether they feel they're doing the right thing. very, very tough to sit with and think about all that while watching the film, but it tells it really, really well. And I think that's why this movie continues to be looked back at so positively, even this long after. I still can't believe that was 1999.
Yeah, I know. That was the year I turned 7. So I certainly did not watch this right around when it came out. Like I said, it was certainly something that was more recent for me, but I had actually finished reading Just Mercy before watching this, not right before, maybe a couple hours before, but it's a book by Brian Stevenson who works on getting wrongfully convicted men off of death row. So it was one of these things where I didn't plan it this way by any means, but I ended up consuming 2 stories that talk about the injustices that people face when they're on death row for something they didn't do. And, this takes place back in like the 30s. So the justice system was certainly not going to be willing to admit they made a mistake. And even Coffey's defense lawyer, who is played by Gary Sinise, by the way, so a return King actor because he was
Yes.
in the Stand miniseries. So that was a fun little catch there. But even he's like, yeah, this guy did it. And when you see him for the first time, he's holding these 2 dead girls with blood all over him. So everyone just jumps to the conclusion he must be the one who did this. And then when you find out that it was Wild Bill who did it and he ends up on death row with John Coffey, and you sort of get that poetic justice, at least a little, because he goes to the mental institution that I believe is the one he was going to transfer to anyway.
Yeah.
And then he shoots Wild Bill, which, while that isn't the right way to go about things, it was the only way John Coffey knew how to sort of get the balance back.
Yeah. I like that we got time with Bill to just seep in, just that he was just a shitty person, like, before we even knew, like, his connection to the story. I like that we just got to know him and his terrible self throughout all those scenes, and then just injecting that, at the end of his life, that it's like that extra punch of just like, oh my gosh, like, he wasn't just this terrible murderer. Because it's interesting that here this movie takes place on death row, and we never get any backstory on any of these characters. I don't know if the book necessarily goes into the individual characters.
I think it does a little more because you get a better sense of how John Coffey has been roaming around, because they do mention that, he's this big guy who basically went unnoticed until he was found holding the 2 girls. Nobody knew where he came from. Nobody knew what he was doing. He would get work here and there. And because of the Depression, I believe, they were like, a lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people are sort of just going from town to town looking for work. So he would have, I guess, kind of blended in with that crowd, done odd jobs here and there. And then it isn't until the flashback where you see how Wild Bill knows the family and the girls because he was doing work for them. It looked like he was painting a barn or something like that. And the father, played by William Sadler, invites him in for supper. And he comes back, cuts the screen, goes in, takes the girls. So it's never really clear how John Coffey knows this, because you see him take the bad out of people and cough it up, but then he also has these visions and knows things when he touches people. So he has more than one ability, and you never really get a sense for when that developed or anything like that. And I think it's that way in the book too, but you do get a little bit more as far as, where he was, what he was doing before all of this happened.
Okay.
But for the most part, the story does take place on the mile.
Okay. Yeah, because it's interesting how in the film we're spending all this time with these characters, like with Dell, who all we're left is with our imagination of just kind of like what could he possibly have done? Like what did he do that was so horrible that he's on death row? And it's interesting that the perspective of
I think he burned a building down with people in it or something.
yeah, it's like interesting with the way Tom Hanks's character talks about his role and what the other guards are there to do. They're there to keep the peace. They're there to almost kind of be friendly with with these potentially horrible people in their last days, because if they keep the peace and they keep things calm, then the whole process goes off without a hitch, and there's not incident. They don't lash out, and they don't fight or flight because they're afraid of the guards. And it's interesting to think about what these guards have to do internally to kind of be playful and calm with potentially terrible people. And then you have this heart-wrenching scene, especially at the end with John Coffey, when they're strapping him in and everything, and he looks to one of them and he says, wipe your face before you stand up, because they're all losing it. Like this is the first time that all these others, they've kind of had this probably twisted friendly relationship with some of these people before they send them to the chair or ride the lightning, as they say. But this is the first time, like, all of them know he's innocent, but there's nothing that they can do, because as you said, it's like even his defense lawyer, when Tom Hanks first gets there and they first start talking, he says, I've heard of the Green Mile. I've lost some clients up that way. So you get the feeling that, he feels like there's some clients that maybe made it to the Green Mile that maybe he didn't feel should have been there, that maybe he didn't do his job as well as he could have. And as a result, maybe some people made it to death row that he didn't feel deserved to go to death row. But then he has this, and in the beginning of that scene, I kind of almost, because I didn't remember, I start thinking, oh, does he feel that way about John Coffey? But he doesn't. Like, and then he tells that terrible story about the dog, and as you said, like, when everyone found him, he's there holding the two girls and they're covered in blood. When Tom Hanks learns he's innocent, he learns it through a vision. But as his wife says to him, like, is there anything that they can do if you tell him that he's innocent? Is there any strings that can be pulled? And he says no, because there's no evidence. There's no evidence to prove. And Bill is dead. And so, like, on top of the fact that they just know that he's innocent, they also know there's nothing that they could do to prove otherwise. And the scene where they find John Coffey in the making of, it was really interesting. Michael Clark Duncan talking about how he was horrified during that scene. Like, he's there on the ground, and he's able to, completely consciously know, oh, everybody's acting right now. But when they get into the scene, he said every single take, when he has those guns pointed at him, and the one gun especially comes up to his neck, he talked about how, like, he just was overcome with this horrifying fear for his life. And it was wild to hear him talk about that scene in that way, that it's here, he knows he's acting, but this image that he's staring at, like, just bridges the reality and the fantasy that he's in. I'm sure it's edited and stuff, for the making of, but it shows him kind of like walking around and just taking like deep breaths, like after doing that scene, and just talking about how difficult that was.
Yeah, and I was mistaken earlier about the crime, so I'm going to run down what the four main prisoners on the mile were in for. Arlen Bitterbuck, who's the first one who is executed, played by Graham Greene. He was found guilty of killing another man during a bar fight over a pair of boots, which that's kind of wild. But then you
Okay.
have Edward Delacroix, who is in for murdering his family. Wild Bill is in for multiple murders. And then obviously you find out that he's the one who killed and raped the girls. But what he did end up being convicted of was a triple homicide, one of which,
Was a pregnant woman, I think.
yeah. And then he had been at Briar Ridge before coming to Cold Mountain, and you can tell because he gets put in the padded room a lot in this too. Not to mention when they throw Percy in, that's just fantastic. But
Yeah.
that's what those guys were in for.
I also love that room was prior to those scenes. Like the room is just, it's a storage room.
Yeah.
Like it was really this representation of how calm the Green Mile seems to typically be. That they don't need to use that room so often that they can stuff it with every last bit of furniture that they don't know what else to do with. And that was a lot of like the playful stuff, like in the beginning of the film, that it's just kind of like you go into this movie and you're like, oh, it's a movie about death row and inmates' last days, and then you're sitting there and you're just kind of like, this is kind of like playful and lighthearted, and I don't know how to feel about it. It's like I'm okay with it because it works, but it just feels bizarre.
Yeah, obviously we can't talk about this movie without talking about Mr. Jingles, the little mouse that ends up being friends with Delacroix.
I love the saga of Mr. Jingles.
And Coffee is able to revive the mouse when the jerk Percy steps on it, and you can see just how big his hands are because they just totally engulf this mouse. And I know mice aren't that big to begin with, but still, if I had one in my hands, you'd see the tail or something popping out. And he just, kind of puts his hands around it and revives it. And Percy can't believe it. He thinks they're pulling his leg when they go tell him that he didn't actually kill the mouse. And I felt like the presence of Mr. Jingles was the epitome of that sort of calmness you were talking about. They don't mind that the mouse is there because clearly Delacroix is feeding it little pieces of, like cornbread that Coffee gives him when Paul's wife makes some. And you just get this sense that Delacroix caring for this mouse so much is the thing that is keeping him somewhat sane, very calm, and then Percy has to come and ruin it all. And then you get this wild story that kind of bookends the movie because you know that Mr. Jingles is still alive 64 years later, I want to say. I think this takes place in 35, but 1999 is when we see the older Paul Edgecombe telling this story. And it's just really amazing how they were able to put everything together and have this adaptation follow the book so well. And Darabont did the same thing with The Shawshank Redemption. It followed the novella so closely, and it was also another very long prison movie. So I think he has a type when it comes to him and Stephen King adaptations.
Yeah, and it was funny that he talked about that in the making of, that he felt like he was gaining this reputation of, almost like he could only do one thing, or like he was the pro at, Stephen King prison movies. But and it was funny because Stephen King visited the set at one point, and they had like a birthday cake for him and everything, because I guess like his birthday was like the Monday before. But they're all like hanging out, and then they're like, "We have a surprise for you," and they bring him into the room with the chair, and Stephen King's like, he's like, "Well, of course, it's like I see the chair, and the first thing I want to do is like." He's just like, oh, strap me in, so they do. But then he's sitting there, and then he's just like, okay, I'm ready to come out now. And Frank Darabont's just like, what's it worth to you? And Stephen King says, your pick of any of the next 3 books or something like that. So it's, it was fun watching. They clearly have this great working relationship and this great respect for each other as storytellers. It's very clear that Frank Darabont has a good understanding of how to take Stephen King's material and portray it and make these films kind of as long as they are. You know, sometimes with the Stephen King books, you know, when I talk with my friends, you know, it's like, oh, that book was really, really great. It's like, but, you know, it's Stephen King, and sometimes it's a little overlong. But Frank Darabont seems to take the extended length of things, but do such a great job in giving it that right flow that maybe, you know, as we've spoken about some of the miniseries where it's like, oh, it's great. I mean, it covers a lot of the things in the book, but it's like then when you take things to the visual medium, it doesn't necessarily always work the same way that it does in a book. And the miniseries haven't always been as successful in keeping that flow going so that you're wrapped into the visual medium the whole time. Whereas like a book, they can take you into the mind and imagination of a character a lot more.
Yeah, I always say that with a book, you can write down anything you want and people get to just visualize it with their imaginations. And with the comic book, you can literally draw anything you want. So you can tell very different stories. And even though with the advancements in technology and CGI getting so much better now, a lot of King adaptations came out at the tail end of the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s when this technology just didn't exist. So when he writes stories like this that has a little bit of a supernatural kind of fantasy element to it, but they're just about characters, you don't need to rely as heavily on those things. Obviously, you know, when he exhales and all the like bugs or ash or whatever it was come
I
out of
couldn't
his
figure out
mouth,
what it was.
you're kind of like, okay, you know, that actually did look good too, though, for 1999.
Exactly. Yeah. Like that. I remember as I was going to watch the movie today, I was like, I could remember that visually. And I was curious how that was going to, look like on this watch. And I was actually very impressed. It's like, you know, is it perfect? No. But did I sit there and I'm like, you know, I wasn't sitting there and thinking like, oh man, look at that CGI. They blended it very, very well. And, you know, with the mix of the practical effects of with lighting, you know, the lights getting hotter and hotter and then breaking and, you know, shattering and sparks going everywhere. And one of the things like a lot of the actors were talking about in the making of was how incredible it was to have that entire like cell block as a set. You know, it's like that's where they were hanging out, you know, through the entirety of making this movie, and that it was so great to be on that set. Everything that they had to interact with was there. I feel like now you're seeing a lot more filmmakers kind of go back to blending the heavy practical effects and then just relying on CGI when necessary. But for a while, you know, between Green Mile and now, CGI became like over reliant on it. And so, you know, it's whether it's 1999 or whether it's now, something that seems to be so consistent is actors like to be able to see the world that they're playing in.
Yeah, it's just amazing how well done this was and how well it stands up 21 years later. And, you know, the same goes for Shawshank, which I believe is about 26 years old now. I think that one came out in 94. And
Okay.
you just get these stories that stand the test of time because of the time that not only they took place, but the time that they became movies and how they went about it. It's like, you know, Star Wars obviously has some things that you notice. You know, space doesn't quite look like real space, but because they use so many practical effects in something like Star Wars, it holds up 40 plus years later. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think that Star Wars
Yeah.
is from, what, 1977, and people are still huge fans of that today. Same with Jaws, too. You know, obviously that shark doesn't look absolutely
Right.
fantastic today, but they worked with what they could, and that's why people will still watch these movies over and over again. And while I'm not super into watching 3-hour movies over and over and over again, I have watched this twice and I loved it both times. It's top tier King adaptations for me. And given all of the ones I've seen so far, it says a lot and also doesn't say a lot at the same time. But when you
sure.
put it into the context of everything that's also come out since then, because I am still watching things as they come out, I'm not like, oh no, I
Yeah.
have to wait for the podcast to watch it, but I keep up with them. And there are some recent ones that are really good. There are some recent ones that aren't as good. And it seems to just ebb and flow, to steal a term that you used earlier with his adaptations. And thankfully, they ended the 1990s on a very, very high note with this one. So this is like 5 out of 5 for me.
Yeah. No, I'm right there with you. I was so pleased with how much I enjoyed it because I'm not gonna call out the podcast or anything that I heard it from, but there's some pop culture podcasts that I've listened to where when they talked about, they were doing like rankings of Stephen King stuff and everything, and it's like when they got to, it'd be like, oh, what do you think about the Green Mile, and they'd just be like, it's okay. And I was just kind of like sitting there thinking, because I hadn't seen it in so long, I'm like, oh my God. I was like, is it one of those ones where it was like, it was really good when it came out and I'm going to watch it and I'm going to be really disappointed? And I was so happy that I wasn't. I don't know what they're thinking when they say it's just okay, but to each their own. But I was kind of nervous going into it because just the way some things age, they may not be as impactful. But I felt this was quite impactful, as we've discussed throughout. The remarkable and terrible how relevant it can still feel right now, even just as a movie. It's entertaining, it's heartbreaking, it checks off all the boxes, and it's 3 hours long that I would absolutely watch again. And so I'm right there with you. Top tier, absolutely top tier King adaptation. I don't know if he has any other prison movies, or prison books, but if not, maybe Frank Darabont needs to do another.
Well, I will let you know, because so far it's been Shawshank and The Green Mile that I know for sure, and Darabont has destroyed it with those adaptations in the best way possible. And I think it's kind of hard to just express how much I enjoyed this movie, because it's not a fun movie either.
Right.
It's one of those movies that makes you think, and it's still relevant 21 years later, and it's kind of terrifying how relevant it still is. But you get this sense of, okay, Percy was the bad guard. The rest of the guys, you had some who were indifferent, which one was named Dean Stanton, which is funny because Harry Dean Stanton was in this. But you have a couple of guards who are kind of just there to do their job, and they don't want to cause any drama. Like when they decide to take Coffee out to heal the warden's wife, who is played by Patricia Clarkson, I might add. And I totally forgot that fact. So seeing her, I was like, oh, wow, they made her look really sick in this movie with the makeup and everything, because I have recently seen her in Sharp Objects. And I was like, oh, wow, 21 years ago, they made her look quite old because she was so sick in the movie and in the story. So it was just one of those things where they knew Percy was going to be a problem, so they handled him. And I think the fact that this took place in the 30s, and obviously it's not a true story, but it's refreshing to know that not everyone was hateful and spiteful, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, they knew he was trouble, and they knew why he was trouble, and they knew why they were stuck with him. One thing I did have a question about, because I'm about to mention it, Dell's death. It was kind of funny. It's like, as I was watching the scene, I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm like, why don't they stop this? It's like he sees the sponges and why don't they stop it? But then it's like, a moment later, there's a line that explains why they don't stop it. I'm like, oh, okay. So it's like every question I had would get answered. But the only question that didn't get answered is I don't understand why the doors seem to be locked and nobody could get out. I don't know if it's just so that the prisoner can't escape, I guess.
I think that's what it is. That was my best guess, because I remember that from the book too. And because they're walking the prisoner in and then strapping him
Right.
in, but
Yeah.
everyone's already sitting there when they do that, as far as I can tell. I
Yeah.
think they lock the doors so that,
It makes sense. Yeah.
and obviously now or more recently, it was separate rooms because when they got rid of execution as a method for the death penalty and they went to lethal injection, it's like two separate rooms from what I can tell based on how I've seen it represented in various media since, the 1930s.
Yeah. But one of the scenes that was interesting in how they had to deal with, this terrible person that they have to work with who clearly didn't understand the proper way, or at least their way, to handle, this world that they have to exist in. After that horrifying death, they tell him off and punch him in the face, and but when the warden comes down and he's clearly trying to he's like, I have to know, it's like, what happened here? And he can tell, the way Tom Hanks delivers it in kind of this, a mistake was made, kind of brushing it off or whatever. And you could tell he's looking at him. He's like, and he says, that's the position you want to go with. And his response is, don't you think it's the one I should? Because they know that, they're not going to be able to go. What is it? His aunt is like a senator's wife or something like that.
Like the governor's wife or something. They call her like
Yeah.
Louisiana's first lady. So I think governor's wife or something like that.
Yeah. And so it's like they seem to know that there's no way that they can turn around and be like, he knew that the sponge had to be wet and he did this on purpose. Like they know that's not going to work. So they just kind of have to play this game a little bit to try and push him out, get him to leave on his own, because they know it's the only way that they're going to get rid of him. And that's just one example of just so many of just the different kind of B stories throughout. There's the main one with John Coffey and everything, but it's like you get a little bit with each of the inmates, but then you get all these side stories with the guards and having to deal with him
and Paul's UTI that Coffey has to make go away. That is something that we see pretty early on. But yeah, I think it's a nice balance of all of the different little storylines that they're going through.
Feels very lived in. It feels full, but not overstuffed. It just feels like nothing feels like it's what's the term? Filler. It's just it all feels necessary to just understand and appreciate and enjoy and be horrified at, and all the other emotions with that go with whichever character you might want to mention.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a line at the end that I think sums up kind of our feeling of, is not an easy, enjoyable thing to watch at times, but the fact that we can revisit it and sit through 3 hours of it as he finishes telling the story at the end when they're older, and he looks at her and says, you don't believe me. She says, no, I know you wouldn't lie to me. It's just, and his response is, it's quite a story. And I feel like that's the perfect sum up of this film, this movie, and probably the book. I own the miniseries, but admittedly, they were my brothers, and I took them. I haven't read them yet, so I'll have to do that soon. Now, having rewatched the film, but it is just in fact a very well done and relevant and probably timeless story.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm out of things to say about it because I just like it so much. And sometimes it's a little harder to talk about movies you like because you're just like, I like it. It's great. Okay.
Yeah, I can't, because it's like I even try and think of, it's like, well, what's something that I could pick out? And it's like, but I don't even want to pick. I don't like to talk about movies that way anyway, of just like, what can I pick out? But it feels like when you have so many positive things to say that you're like, well, there's got to be something I can be critical about, just in the natural feeling of talking about a movie. But I just really, really like this movie, and I was so happy that I still really liked this movie as much as as much as I did when I first watched it.
Same. Well, Tim, thank you so much for joining me to talk about The Green Mile today. It has been a fun discussion, and I know you will be back on soon. I believe we're both reading Dreamcatcher right now.
Yes. So that maybe won't be as overly positive. We'll see.
We'll see. All right, that does it for this episode of Chat Sematary. You can support the podcast on Patreon. For $1 a month, you'll get a thank you on the show. For $2 a month, I will send you a Chat Sematary sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.